Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Show Me SaaS. I am fortunate to be joined by my same partners in crime we've had on prior episodes here. I'm Todd Golding, by the way. Michael Beardsley. Michael, you want to say hi? Michael's here. Toby, who you've seen before, I'm sure. Toby, you want to raise your hand? And we are here today to talk about a topic that is near and dear to our heart, and one that we talk to customers about all the time, and ends up being a topic that ends up touching an awful lot of SaaS architecture, which is this notion of onboarding. And when you sort of first talk about the notion of onboarding, you think, yes, like, of course, yes, we've got to get tenants on board, and we'll set that up so somebody can sign up. And that sort of just gets pushed sometimes to the background as, of course, there's a sign up page and people sign up, but what's that really got to do with my SaaS architecture? But the reality is, when we work with organizations that are building SaaS solutions, this is often where we start a whole lot of the discussion of what it is your SaaS architecture is going to look like, how it's going to be automated, how it's going to get provisioned and set up, because so much of that experience is orchestrated and brought to life by the onboarding experience. And so our goal for the episode today was to maybe first talk a little bit about like just kind of the conceptual bits of onboarding and what are some of the sort of moving parts of onboarding, and then really look at some code behind onboarding. We'll look at a couple of flavors of what it means to implement onboarding, because you'll also see in this discussion there's just tons of permutations of what it means to really orchestrate onboarding and automate onboarding and so on. But maybe we can start the discussion by just talking about, what's the big deal with onboarding? Why do we see onboarding as being this sort of pivotal sort of component of this? So maybe Michael, I'll throw to you and put you on the spot a little bit here. You obviously have built onboarding experiences and you've helped customers through them. Like, why is that a big part of the discussion for you?
Well, I think two things jumped to my head. One is, we often talk, and I think we even made a joke about it in the show title today, that we talk about trying to make onboarding frictionless or easy and smooth and automated. But I think onboarding, and we'll talk more about this as we go through the day, you sort of go through a spectrum. And just because we say it should be low friction or automated doesn't mean that every architecture out there or business use case or example can truly be fully automated. Often there's still human parts to the steps that have to be taken. It's more about how can you make your company the most efficient to get your new tenants onboarded so that they can get to that point of value very quickly to engage in your product, in your service, and increase their loyalty to your platform. But the other thing, like if we step back, I think onboarding might be a new term that some people don't use. I think we use it almost explicitly to differentiate between registration or sign up, because it's so much more, right? It's not just taking some bits of information about a user, like their name, and what password do they want to use, and some sort of contact information, and putting it in a database and saying, okay, I'm done, right? In a SaaS world, onboarding is not only that, but it's wiring together all the other pieces of getting that entity ready to actually use your service. And we're going to talk a lot today about what it means. Like, what are all the things you have to think about to get your platform ready to support that tenant and that tenant's users in terms of, again, getting value from your SaaS service.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out you make there, Michael, which is that onboarding probably needs a little more definition, a little more scope here, right? Because the reality is, for us, when we talk about onboarding, we're talking about everything it takes to take a new customer and have everything about them configured to be able to consume and run your system. And if you think back to like episode 1, where we talked about all the different deployment models and all the other different sort of nuances of what it means to be SaaS, those show up. And we're going to see that as we get further into the discussion. Those show up in onboarding, right? Like the decisions you make about the footprint of your SaaS architecture, what's siloed and what's pooled, things we've talked about in our prior episodes, those all play out inside this onboarding experience. And And I think where a lot of the onboarding discussion gets lost in conversations I have with customers is this B2C versus B2B discussion, right? Because people will say, yeah, B2C, of course, I'm going to go sign up for some system that has 10,000 users and they'll have some sign up process for me, and that's onboarding. And they'll say, but we're not that. We're B2B. We do this long contractual negotiation before somebody signs up, and we're only signing up hundreds of customers. So onboarding doesn't matter to us. But the reality is onboarding, even across that entire spectrum of experiences, is still meant to be a time to value experience for your customer. It's how fast can I do it and how quickly can we do it? And whether it's B2C or B2B, we would still expect that as much of that experience to be automated, repeatable, et cetera, as possible. It becomes a unit of scale to the business.
Right. We got a comment, Todd. I'm gonna drop this in because I think it's relevant. So the question was this, and then there's a follow on to that.
Sure.
Not just registration, and then the follow on. So I think it's a perfect time to address that.
Can you go back to the first one though, Toby? I didn't read it.
The first one is
What are you doing other than registration that makes onboarding and not just a registration?
And
we're going to get into this.
Our whole show.
This is the whole show, right? Which is exactly. So hopefully we're going to answer this question along the way for you, but we definitely, registration has a user connotation. It's sort of, it makes, you are creating the footprint of some user in your system so they can log in. Onboarding to us is the orchestration and the creation and the configuration of the infrastructure and the environment to meet the needs of that customer. And sometimes, even if it's just a really simple setup, there's still more moving parts to it. And you'll see that. And you'll see that, by the way, across almost all of our implementations. Toby, was there another question related?
No, he was just kind of adding some color there. Wanted to know specifically what were some real good examples of.
You'll see them. So I would just say we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but if by the end of this we haven't answered that question for you, please chime back in and we'll try to be more specific. But I believe we'll get to the answer to that for you. So Toby, I guess as the guy whose background has been more in building out EKS, and then more recently, maybe looking at building out some of the things we're doing in SaaS Boost. But when you built out the onboarding experience, that was part of the EKS bit. Like, were there nuances to that? Were there more moving parts to that than you expected, or was it pretty straightforward?
Well, the hard part for EKS specifically was, how do we exercise EKS as a thing in our onboarding code, right? Like, we originally kind of went down the route of trying to maybe hit the EKS, the Kubernetes API and start exercising the Kubernetes bits that way, creating namespace programmatically via the API and doing that, and then talk to some internal folks and no, that's not the way to do it because that API is always changing. So we had to kind of roll back off of that. So we've got two phases. We'll see a slide about this in a little bit. Two phases of it. One is where we are kind of creating the infrastructure, to Todd's point, creating all of the stuff that supports that new tenant, and that's AWS infrastructure. And then the second part of that is how do we provision the stuff inside the cluster? In our case, it's a single cluster, but you could imagine this could extend to multiple clusters. But how do we provision the stuff that's in the cluster, all of the namespaces, all of the artifacts that are specific to that tenant as a separate step? And then for that, we use code pipeline, and I'll show all that.
Yeah, we'll get into those details, but obviously it was in terms of that implementation, I would imagine it represented a big part of that project.
Totally. Yeah. That was definitely one of the stickier points when we set out to kind of write this, again, we call it reference architecture, but this example of what it might look like to do multi-tenancy in EKS, that was one of the parts where we kind of swirled a lot and thought a lot about it.
Yeah. I'm thinking, given the question and given that we're headed this direction anyway, I'm going to jump to this slide, which to me is it's a sample, by the way. Almost every drawing, every illustration we have here is an example of an implementation, not the implementation, but this is an example of an onboarding experience where we have a registration service. And don't worry about whether this happens to be out of a Lambda presentation. It could have been any system. You'll see it. The code Michael's done looks different than this. The code that Toby's done in EKS looks different than this. But the themes that are here are consistent themes across all those experiences, which is there's some registration process that is taking a request to create a tenant, and then it is creating the user. That's true, but there's a lot of moving parts creating a user, and we talked about that in our last show on identity. It's creating the footprint of the tenant and all the policies related to that tenant and the configuration. It's orchestrating integration with the billing experience, typically here, like either internal or external billing system. I have to create the footprint view, figure out what plan you signed up for, and go create that. And then this dashed line you see at the bottom is this placeholder for provisioning, which is where I have to say, what's all the infrastructure or configuration of the environment that I have to do for this particular onboarding experience. And this is where we're going to focus more of our time today. Certainly billing will be a whole separate topic. We've hit identity and user management a fair amount in the last episode. So those are the moving parts here. But obviously you can see as part of registration, like there's a lot of bits here to get right and to orchestrate here, and a lot of opportunities where you have to have an architecture that will say, well, what happens if one of these things fails, for example? Actually, I'd say something in our content we probably need to do more is to share more about how do you handle the failures scenarios here.
And there's sequencing, right? So Todd, you've got numbers on this slide, and we're not really like clicking through it like a reInvent presentation or anything, but there some of these activities can happen in parallel. Some are prerequisite that have to happen before somebody else. So you get, some sequencing going on. Some can be retried and some can't. Some are just, fatal right away. And you got to sort of figure out how to roll things back and let the system and the user know what the state is. So there's a lot of state management in onboarding. Even when we talk about a pooled architecture and you're like, well, I'm not really provisioning new infrastructure because my database already exists, my compute already exists, everyone's going to share it, I've got policies to deal with that, and maybe all my policies are dynamic, and so they're all runtime evaluated, so I have nothing to provision, quote unquote. There's still going to be stuff you have to think through and sequencing that has to happen to get that tenant, those users for that tenant ready to actually consume your service.
Yeah, that's a good call out. And I guess for me, even like you mentioned there, like policies, right? That's when, like, I've got them here as showing as cognito policies, but whatever your isolation story is often can include some kind of configuration of that isolation experience. And we've talked about in the prior presentation, parts of your system could be siloed, parts are pooled. So you may, based on the kind of tenant that's onboarding, you may be, if you're a DynamoDB table per tenant, somewhere in here, this thing has to know, hey, for this service that is a pooled service, I still have to provision a separate table for this tenant during the onboarding process. So you end up with, often end up with a smattering of different infrastructure elements, even in a pooled environment that may have siloed infrastructure that gets.
Well, I think you're hinting at something. We could make this diagram wildly more complicated if we threw tiers in. So let's talk a little bit about tiers and packaging. Like
that's where I was going next. Let's go there. Like, how does tiers, like you, Toby, you jump in the conversation. You're like, how could tiers influence this experience or change it?
Well, I think it's depending on it. I guess if you let tiers influence the style of deployment. So if it's a siloed versus a pool deployment, we talked about that a little bit already, but in our case, and the stuff in the code I'll show later, if we are, let's say, into some premium tier, we're deploying a siloed infrastructure, meaning that we're gonna give you your own DynamoDB tables and your own services for exclusive use by that tenant. Those decisions have to be made somewhere, and then the infrastructure, the shape of your deployment has to change in response to that. So a big factor there. So to your point, to your question. If it affects your deployment, then obviously onboarding is affected by that as well.
Yeah, I think this is where the line gets blurry to me, right? So I'll ask this question of either one of you. You can answer. Obviously, when we do this registration, and let's say we are provisioning infrastructure in this process, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, but still we're provisioning infrastructure. Is this part of my DevOps pipeline, or is this just part of my app, or where would you draw
That's
that line? And I will admit that it's a loaded question, by the way.
It's a tough one. Yeah, for me, I'll jump in first, and Michael, feel free to jump in after. But I feel that, like, when we first started talking about this, and I kept hearing people at SaaS Factory internally, and we were talking about DevOps, it kind of felt a little wrong to me, because for me, DevOps was more like, DevOps is the cradle to grave management of a service, right? A cross-functional team that does the testing, does the deployment, does the whatever. Everybody is all about, it's all the two pizza teams thing we talk about at Amazon. And it's all about, how do you get that code to deployed in as short as time as possible with all those processes kind of in that chain. And it's not so much about tenancy, right? It's not so much about deploying tenants, but when you're talking about tenancy, when you're talking about deployments, a lot of those same mechanisms are useful there. So it is, I feel like there's another word we need to come up with that is maybe like SaaS ops or something like that is not quite DevOps, because they are similar, but it's nuanced. So that my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think it does. It gets really blurry, and it's really interesting conversations to have, because you take the classic DevOps sort of nuts and bolts, that the activities that people who are performing DevOps are doing, which, like Toby said, is building and testing the artifacts, staging them, getting them properly deployed to production, and then the ops side, right? And then actually like managing and operating and monitoring and understanding, how to roll forward, how to roll back, and all that's true. And the challenge with SaaS is that whole, all of that I just said in a big mouthful happens with every tenant in your system, and happens at sort of runtime in an unknown, unbounded kind of a way. And then tenants have life cycles, right? They come, they go, they disable, they maybe move tiers. I mean, some of this obviously would be business decisions that you're making about your service and what kind of features you do and don't want to support. But the point is that all of those DevOps-like activities now aren't at this really high level of your product team. Now they're at this runtime level of a tenant actually wanting to take advantage of your service. And so it sort of shifts it all around and makes it really interesting to think about, how do I do this? Not just once and sort of my best practice of what's my pipeline to go from A to Z, but how do I do it dynamically as new tenants come into my world?
And I think go ahead, Toby.
Well, I was also going to kind of tack on to the comment about changing tiers, right? Like that could be a really hard problem.
Yeah.
So if it's something, as you said, if it's a business wants to support that, that's something you should think about like early and often, right? Like if you've got a pooled database that needs to move into a siloed database, what does it look like to extricate that data? And all the policies around that.
Well, and gosh, not even moving tiers, but what if you just want to change your configuration a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like what does it mean to take the same tier that you've had?
Sure.
And as a business want to change that, right? We've all, I think one way to think about this is in the old days, right? Dealing with like relational databases and object relational mapping libraries and this real tight binding between, what are your table structures and what does your domain code look like? And somewhere along the line, you got to get them synced up and you want to, change your database. And so you got to change your code, and there's a chicken and egg problem there. That kind of thought process and problem solving you're going to have to do when you want to change your infrastructure or supporting your service.
Yeah, I think for me, where this one sort of blurred the lines the most for me, maybe, so I don't necessarily have an absolute answer to this, to me is traditionally for me, like these DevOps processes were triggered by the team, right? The microservice team or the development team said, we're going to push something out and we're going to run our DevOps process, and our infrastructure automation will apply this change and update this code or update this infrastructure, whatever it's going to do. And then this model, the trigger for a whole lot of infrastructure automation isn't triggered by somebody internally. It's triggered by somebody externally, potentially saying, I want to onboard a new tenant. So to me, you could go to bed at night and wake up with, 10 more tenants in your system with like all this infrastructure provisioned, and the stuff that's doing that work is the same stuff that is the classic CI/CD sort of infrastructure provisioning and automation tools. And this is where you get scale in a SaaS business. Like if that process has to be able to run pretty autonomously and grow autonomously and configure and bring new tenants on, right? Go ahead.
And frictionless, right? Like you said, like it has to be. And I got an example of that. I'll come back to that, but.
And I do want to, like, the other tiering piece of this that might get lost in this discussion is, tiering is not just somebody pays slightly different money, or they get like tiering could mean you're running entirely different infrastructure footprint, right? We often think, well, we think of this as a binary decision. Well, we're siloed, so we'll only be provisioning siloed tenants, or we're pooled, we'll only have this pooled environment. And it's true, you might be one of those two, but the reality is the tiers may be some blend of any of those things. And so as somebody comes in and onboards, you're not just triggering infrastructure automation, you're looking at what their entire infrastructure footprint needs to be for that tier, including when you deploy new versions of the app. So even after sort of onboarding is done, now when I go to deploy a version of the application, that application now has to know, well, what things are siloed, which things are pooled, and who gets this deployment and how. So that's a DevOpsy thing. So for me, I don't know that we call it DevOps, but I don't know what else to call it because it is infrastructure automation.
It's absolutely fair. Yeah, like when I think you and I had this conversation, when I first had heartburn about the term DevOps, but it's a great point, and I don't know what to call it. It just feels like it may be overloading that term.
Now, I will, just to sort of drive this home a little bit more. Think about all the different models we talked about that you could deploy. And I'm not going to cover them all here, but we talked about siloed models where you could have an account per tenant and a VPC per tenant, obviously, in that provisioning step. And Michael's going to show you a little bit of what VPC per tenant could look like, because that's a model that SaaS Boost is actually using. But we see a lot of people use account per tenant as well. And there's like setting account limits and all those other things that have to be all part of this automation experience, the best you can get them. Or if you're even pooled, there's all kinds of variations of pooled, like pooled in a VPC, pooled EKS cluster, pooled Lambda functions. And you could have these pooled and these siloed environments running side by side. So when you get to this sort of, if I go back to this step 8 in this prior diagram, somewhere in that box is all that magic that has to happen to bring those environments to life. Cool. So I think we hit on that. I want to definitely leave enough time. We can come back to other topics here. But Michael, I thought we would pivot to the VPC per tenant sort of model of this, and just to give you a sense of what it means for somebody to onboard in that experience. And I know that in the solution you have, there's so much code and so many moving parts that it will be hard for us to like walk it all end to end, but to the best of your ability, if you could connect some of the dots for us, that would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Before we dive right into that, because it is a huge topic and we could spend a ton of time on it. Is it helpful, I wonder, for the audience to hear maybe just sort of a menu of some of the tools that we have available in AWS to help facilitate some of this stuff, right? And maybe it's just listing it out, but it's all the kinds of things that would help you with automation. So clearly, infrastructure as code is huge here. If you have to actually provision resources, you're going to be wanting to look at something like CDK or CloudFormation or Terraform, something like that. If maybe you're not really provisioning infrastructure because it's already existing, maybe you've got an API gateway, but because of your tiering, you want to do different throttling, right, for a given API. Well, then maybe you're looking at directly invoking API gateway calls with an SDK. And so how do you do that? Well, obviously you've got code that you bring the SDK libraries in, and you can directly invoke the existing resources that are being shared. And then there are our sort of orchestration services that help glue pieces together. And I think we'll all show some ideas about how to leverage some of those things like code pipeline, things like step functions,
Sure.
things like Event Bridge and our messaging services and our queuing services. So just maybe keep those sort of product names, if you will, or topics sort of floating around in your head as we go through some of this.
Yeah, it's a good call out because, and I will say that I mean, it's just like anybody, if you talk to anybody just about DevOps, not even SaaS, and you say like, well, what's your infrastructure automation? Like the number of tools and the number of technologies and the way that you can sort of stitch them together is wildly different. And then separate from that, and we'll see this when we go from what you're talking about, what Toby's talking about, like when we get to EKS, we're going to see like, oh, wait a minute, EKS offers me tools in that tool chain as well that
just
are very
Kubernetes
specific to EKS to glue this stuff together, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
We had a couple of slides, Todd.
Yeah, let me
high level.
Let me get to that for you.
Yeah.
You want to start here, or do you want to start with the other one?
This is fine. Okay. We'll go through this quickly, right? So just at a really high level. So now we're talking about what does it mean to think about an onboarding system where you do have to provision infrastructure per tenant, and then, as you see here, as we go through, obviously, there's some sort of registration experience, whether your sales team or your customer success team is triggering that onboarding, or whether it's happening through sort of more of a B2C sort of experience where the end customer is triggering the registration. Regardless, you are submitting some sort of a request into the system that has to go through these steps of creating the tenant and then starting to provision the environment. And sometimes there's infrastructure that you have to provision per tenant. And then sometimes there are multiple pieces of infrastructure that you have to implement per tenant. So if you have a microservices architecture, for example, maybe you'll have sort of one of pieces of resources like the network, right? Like the VPC, but then maybe you'll have many containers, right? So one for each microservice or databases or things like that. So you have to think about provisioning, splitting up into these kind of two different phases. And I know Toby's going to talk about different phases too when he gets into some Kubernetes stuff. And then once, of course, you've got everything provisioned, you've got to somehow to wrap up that DevOps conversation, you've got to get your workload deployed out to that new infrastructure so that the customer can start taking advantage of it.
And I think, Michael, to me, that last step, that deploy action, is one that gets lost here in the shuffle sometimes, because the assumption is, oh, I'm doing a VPC per tenant, or I'm doing account per tenant, and so I've got to run all this infrastructure automation to get the entire VPC set up, and I got all the infrastructure set up, but also obviously, because it's a per tenant construct, I also have to deploy the application every time a tenant onboards in that scenario. And sometimes people will forget that that's part of that experience as well, and think no, I'll provision the VPC, I'll set all the infrastructure up, and something else deploys it. It might be a different tool that deploys it, but it's still part of this process.
Maybe. And can you devise a system where the deployment as sort of the tail end of onboarding is the same tooling and the same mechanisms as deploying when you update your service?
Including here, you could deploy the application with different configurations. I think, Toby, don't we, even in the right as you take a drink, I'll throw a question your way.
No, go ahead.
I don't want to jump ahead to the EKS, but and I think, Michael, this might even apply here, is you could say, because this is a per tenant construct, these tenants could have a different application, like a different scaling sort of configuration than a pool tenant might have, right?
Yep, for sure. Let's go on. What do we have here?
And then this is kind of your sort of step-by-step view.
Right. So here's a bit of a workflow. This is an older slide from some earlier thoughts on SaaS Boost. And if people don't know, SaaS Boost is an open source set of tooling that we built that help companies sort of get up to speed quickly with an environment that they can put their workload into and then deliver to the market to their customers in a SaaS sort of a model. And we've automated and built this big onboarding flow with all these automations. And you can see it goes through this, what is sort of shown as a linear process, but you'll see when we get into the code here a little bit, it's actually fairly asynchronous. Some of it is asynchronous because we've sort of embraced an event-driven architecture. But you can see some of these tools that I was talking about before, where you've got eventing type tooling like SNS and EventBridge. You've got some compute in there to glue things together and to make SDK calls with Lambda icon that we've got in there. And then there's that blue icon for code pipeline where we can sort of orchestrate this multi-step process to get the workload deployed out to the infrastructure that was just provisioned. So what we thought we would do today, hopefully people think this is interesting and don't get too lost on it. We could dive into some of the code that actually makes this happen, and so that we can take a look at how we actually wired some of this together.
Hey, Michael, before you do that real quick.
Yep.
So to me, I think one of the things that maybe is in a siloed environment like this, especially full stack silo VPC per tenant, we can see these different states: created, provisioning, provisioned, deploying, deployed, right? That for me, this is, you sort of have to acknowledge as part of your onboarding experience that it's going through a life cycle, and that the tenant may not be live immediately because there's a lot of moving parts to get that tenant to be alive. And so to me, this has an effect all the way out to tenant management and other things that are observing the state of the tenant. Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of maybe that life cycle changes that experience a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And we have had design discussions, that you might have at your companies when you're thinking about your service and how you want the tenant experience to be, of whether we would consider a tenant to actually be sort of alive and addressable by the system prior to onboarding being finished. Or, as you say, as you look through all these different states of what it means to go through onboarding, is there a point somewhere along this flow where we consider the tenant to be alive, maybe in a degraded state? Maybe we've provisioned all their infrastructure and everything's set up, but for whatever reason, the workload hasn't deployed yet, right? And that may mean something different to your business than having it all the infrastructure provisioned and your workload deployed. Or maybe the billing hasn't been wired up properly yet. And again, we go back to the comments that I made earlier. At any point, anywhere along here, things can fail. Especially when you're integrating with outside services. And so you have to think about, what can I retry? What can't I retry? If I am retrying, how many retries do I make before I give up and say that it's not working? How do I gather operational visibility into this so that I can react to a failed onboarding, a succeeded onboarding, a degraded onboarding? So there's a lot of business, what we always like to call non-functional requirements, right? When we're trying to put together our scrums, right? There's a lot of business decisions that I think can help drive how you want to deal with some of this stuff, and how complicated and complex your software is going to have to be to support those business decisions.
Cool. And Michael, sorry, just a couple more one more thing here that I wanted to hit at, and it's more of an AWS centric thing, which is obviously, and Toby, if you've got an EKS angle on this, feel free to chime in as well.
Sure.
What about things like account limits, or things where like I have like a certain amount of a quota of something, and obviously I'm provisioning infrastructure here, and I could hit those limits, not because I've exceeded them, but just because they're maybe not set high enough yet? Or like, how is that something I do outside of this process, or is it something I do inside this process?
I mean, we don't hit that today in EKS. We haven't really addressed that. But, if I were advising a customer or a partner on this, it would definitely be something to think about ahead of time, right? Like let's do worst case scenario and figure out, are we bumping up against any of these? And if so, maybe doing some sharding or account sharding, right? Some kind of strategy up in front of all of this that will handle those limits appropriately.
Yeah.
My my operating system here is unhappy with me. Let's see if I can get this. All right, switch back over. If my screen freezes, we will bail to Kubernetes land.
Beauties of technology. All right, Michael.
Right?
So I don't know if you wanted to dive in or what you want to do here.
Yeah, sure. So you saw the diagram there on the PowerPoint slide, and now we can sort of look at, like, what does that mean to actually realize that in code? And so here you can see an example where we basically have this entry point into the onboarding system that is handling all these different types of events. And you can see through, this happens to be written in Java. I can zoom in and make sure everybody can kind of see what it is. But we get these event messages coming into the microservice. We determine what flavor of event it is, and then we go and we do whatever the specific code is to handle that event. And it really helps to draw out, I found for myself, the sort of the universe of events and the different pieces that are going to care about these events and what actions they're going to take on it. So clearly we start out with some sort of post to the system to kind of kick it all off. And that, is this fairly simplistic function. All this stuff I'm scrolling through here is just basic, like, block and tackling. Did I get a valid message? But once I've got a valid message, really all I'm doing is I'm gonna save this thing to my database. So here's my data access layer. So I'm gonna save this object that just came in from the internet through an API call, through a web form, through some sort of sign up process. I got a packet of data that says, hey, I want to onboard this tenant. So I'm going to capture that. I'm going to save it. I'm going to persist it. And then I'm immediately going to publish an event. And in SaaS Boost, we are leveraging EventBridge. So EventBridge is an AWS service. It's a managed service bus that can both consume events from AWS services. So all the AWS services publish events for all kinds of things, and you can subscribe to those events, and you can write really complex filtering rules in EventBridge that you can then trigger all kinds of different actions to be taken based on an event that you've filtered out. So how is EventBridge different than, like, SNS, for example? Because it sounds pretty similar, and it's true. SNS has less filtering capabilities, and it doesn't have as many endpoints that are pre-wired for you. Of course, SNS can talk to Lambda, so you can do anything you want, but EventBridge comes out of the box with a whole bunch of different connections, and the filtering is quite a bit more sophisticated in EventBridge, which is really nice, so that you don't have to do that all in a Lambda, for example, like you would in SNS. The advantage of SNS is that it's at a much higher scale. So if you have a bazillion messages coming in, SNS might be a better option for you.
So Michael, a quick question here. So to me, that, and you don't have to go back to this screen, but we essentially, you've built this out as kind of a state machine, essentially, that is kind of correlates to those states we saw back in the slide, right? Mm-hmm. And you're essentially using, if I interpret this correctly, EventBridge as the sort of messaging bus to process and publish the messages and fire the messages that push you into the next state and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Where we can. Now, one big caveat, and it's a bit of a disappointment, CloudFormation. We all love CloudFormation. It allows us to automate infrastructure at AWS. The CloudFormation service does not publish its events to EventBridge like most all of our other services do. And so to use CloudFormation in an event-based choreographed system, you have to talk to SNS. And the packets of information that you get from CloudFormation via SNS also don't really follow the canonical pattern of JSON objects. So it's in sort of its own little bit old school format. You got to process it differently, but at the end of the day, it's basically the same thing. You've got some sort of event system that's publishing events. Some of those events might just go into the ether and never get acted upon, but if you care about them, you can subscribe to consume them either through a rule in EventBridge or a topic subscription in SNS, and then you can take action on them. So that's what we do here. And I'll just dive into one where I'll say that, so when I have an initiated onboarding request, then I can jump into my first sort of handler here. And what am I doing? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to validate that the request for onboarding is valid. So the information that I got is valid, and that my environment, my AWS account, my system is also valid and ready to take this new tenant on. And so we go through this whole validation process that is almost like a sub-process inside of this big thing. And here's a good example where a number of things could either fail and be retried because of timing, or they might fail altogether. So what we do here is we take advantage of another AWS tool. We take advantage of SQS. So we take advantage of the simple queuing service. And all that this message or all that this handler is doing is it's really, it is plopping a message onto an SQS queue to say, hey, now go validate this onboarding request. And then now we have a place where we can put things back and try them again. So for example, because I know we'll run out of time if we just spend all day talking here, but for example, in SaaS Boost, we have to light up, your, for example, your ECR repositories to host your Docker images that we then wire up to Code Pipeline to deploy for you later. Well, in setting those up, CloudFormation is creating those repositories and getting them ready, and you need to upload your Docker images to them. And maybe that hasn't finished yet. Maybe you've said, hey, go onboard this, but you don't actually have your images there ready to go. Or maybe a CloudFormation stack that's actually creating the repository, maybe it hasn't finished either. So yes, that's a failure, but that's a failure that can overcome itself, right, if you wait long enough for it to happen. Right. So that's an example where we're using a queue so that either, in most cases, it'll all just go through and it'll be really fast. But in some cases, we may need to wait for a couple of minutes and try again. So again, all these ideas about, how do you handle these events? What do you do when they fail? Can they be retried? Can they not be retried? Really think about where you're integrating with some other system, even if that other system is yourself, right? Some other microservice that you have, or even an AWS system like CloudFormation. You might have to wait for CloudFormation to finish before. Remember, AWS is also built on the premise of eventual consistency. Even creating a DynamoDB table is not instant. Right? The SDK call will come back and say, cool, I got your create table call. I did it. You're welcome. 200 response. But the reality is the table isn't there yet and ready for you to write against. Now, usually that happens so fast that you don't notice it, but there will be a time where it will break because AWS is an eventually consistent platform. And so you got to think about those kinds of things when you're building these big onboarding systems.
Awesome. Well, we're going to pivot, I know, here, but I do want to just say that, part of the reason we picked this example is because it's on one end of the extreme, right? The more you're leaning into this bigger per tenant infrastructure sort of footprint, and it could be, you'd need this all across all the examples, but it's definitely a huge part of the experience when you're doing something as big as VPC per tenant and provisioning all these other bits. So all these mechanisms about retrying and did it finish and is that resource available suddenly add a ton of complexity to your onboarding process. And because we have this frictionless goal, we can't say, well, we'll just kind of punt on these things and make them steps that, it'll get it up and running. We want that to be running, like we said, overnight. So just because the complexity of what's getting deployed goes up doesn't mean that we lower our frictionless sort of bar.
Totally.
Cool. Well, Toby, I know you have an EKS version of this, and now on the EKS side of this, obviously now we are not just talking about like AWS constructs. We're talking about EKS sort of constructs, which it has its own sort of universe that you have to navigate here to figure out how to either provision a siloed or a pooled sort of environment. Do you want me to throw up that initial slide, or where would you?
Yeah, we could quickly talk about that. It'll give me a reference.
You start where you want here. Is that
yeah?
Where you want to start?
Yeah, we saw this. I think we kind of had this slide. If anybody tuned in last week, we had this same slide, and we talked about more the upper boxes 4 and 5 there. We'll use this to frame the discussion for our onboarding, because this is all part and parcel with the identity piece here. But effectively, we get some requests. That request hits a service that's public facing, and then that service is responsible for automating, as we said before, some of the AWS infrastructure. So what new stuff has to be created in order to support that tenant on the AWS side. And then also we enter Kubernetes land, right? And I talked about how do we do that? Are we invoking APIs in the Kubernetes server? Or are we doing something different? In this, we opted to use Code Pipeline. And in Code Pipeline, if you aren't familiar, is just a typical CI/CD kind of system where you've got the ability to run a script, and that script you've got normal Linux commands that run in a container, a build container for you. So we'll dive into the code here. So I'm gonna.
Cool. I will say, Toby, I do find it always interesting as you start looking across the different stacks. Like the top half of this diagram often looks similar, and then what happens at the bottom half of this diagram is where things start to look different.
So yeah, going back to your comment about the magic box, right? When you provision, right, there's that magic box. So this is this slide. I'll just really quickly address this, talking about how now this is specific to the workshop. We don't have this capability right now in the reference architecture. So I'll provide some links to that as we go here. But so in the workshop, which for those who don't know, is just a stepwise learning activity to try to teach you the concepts that we had in the reference architecture, in the EKS SaaS reference architecture. So this is a lab that has all this stuff it kind of baked into it. In this particular workshop, we're deploying into 2 distinct deployments kind of scenarios, one being siloed for everybody but a premium tier tenant, and then everybody being pooled for everybody but a premium tier tenant. And then the premium tier tenants are getting their own infrastructure by way of a siloed kind of deployment. So just showing the 2 distinct deployment profiles.
Yeah, and it's important to probably note the difference here of that. We often talk about reference architectures, which are just like download it, install it, and you have a ready to go reference architecture. And they have corresponding workshops, which are more like Toby said, stepwise kind of ways to introduce you to the concepts, and they're not always up in the exact same state. So in this case, if you're more interested in seeing this siloed and versus pooled model of onboarding, the workshop's more oriented towards that right now. So and I think that probably ties into our onboarding story a little better today than what's in the current reference architecture.
Yep. So let's dive to code. So real quick here, we've got just a controller. This is a typical REST service, right? So this is the public presence, if you will. The contract that's defined is by way of this, the body that we're getting here. It's just a DTO that we're getting. So when our tenants come in, where they want to register, they filled out the form. It's this DTO. If we were to jump to that, you see that it has email, company name, and plan. Of course, this is not meant to be production grade or anything like that. And it's going to be lacking a lot of the retry and all of the stuff that Michael had referenced before. This is kind of just more of an educational experience, but get a DTO. And now we're just going to leverage some service to go create our registration. We'll look at what that does. So first thing we're doing, much like Michael was doing, is we're storing it. We're not doing anything asynchronous here. This is just straight up go store it. The storing it is just poking that into a DynamoDB table. Nothing terribly exciting here. We're just using DynamoDB SDK. And then once we store it, we have this other method called register. And this is where some of the more interesting bits here. You can see that there's a step or two in the workshop that would walk you through this more educationally. But you can see that when we first start off, we've got this, go get the user pool, go get the pooled user pool. So in this case, if you're a regular tier tenant, you're in the same user pool with everybody else. If you are premium tier, we're going to issue your own user pool in addition to some other stuff, and we'll take a look at that other stuff.
And we covered this, by the way, in our previous work, the identity side of this, right?
Yeah.
This notion of user pools. So if you're curious what Toby's getting at there, you can see that in the prior episode.
Yep. So in this particular case, when we first start off the workshop, everybody's pooled. We're going to say, go get the pooled user pool. But at some point in the workshop, we'll tell you, hey, uncomment these lines, and it'll actually introduce this new concept of doing it on a tier based on tier, right? So if I were to actually uncomment that and go to that method, we'll see that it's doing some stuff based on the plan type, right? So premium, this pool type was set on the plan type. So when the beginning on that registration form, if you elected premium, we're going to say that you are siloed, and that comes down, that carries us down here. And if we don't have an existing user pool for you, we're going to go ahead and create one. And again, this is the AWS side of the house, where I was mentioning there's some AWS infrastructure we have to take care of. In this particular case, it's only the user pool. And then once we've done that, we'll go back to where we left off here. We store some information, and then we go back to the kicking off the start pipeline. So notice that if it's not premium, then just get out of here. But if it is premium, go kick off this pipeline, because there's some other interesting stuff that happens there in Kubernetes that we need to take care of for this premium tenant. And that pipeline is really just, let me open up the build spec here. It's just this guy. So sorry, this is going to be a bit of an eye chart. There's a lot of stuff that goes on here, but I'll try to break it down just in chunks. Again, this is a big YAML file with some phases in here that gets executed by code pipeline. The first one being just go get some tools. So we need kube control, which is the CLI, the command line interface that we're using to automate Kubernetes. So we download kube control. We download EKS Cuddle, which is a tool to do some EKS specific bits with surrounding identity there, and just some other stuff. JQ, the AWS CLI, set some environments, and then we actually we set the environment variables based on a CloudFormation deployment. And then we go and do the Kubernetes stuff. So we're creating the namespace. We're creating separate. We're using the SDK to create new tables for that siloed tenant. Yes, both products.
So for me, Toby, just to interrupt you here, this is a good contrast to what Michael was doing earlier, right? So whereas before, Michael was probably had a combination of code and then AWS sort of mechanisms here to configure the VPC, and it was maybe more CloudFormation heavy. Here, you're relying on kube control and EKS control to do a lot of the configuration inside the cluster, inside the EKS cluster, right?
Yeah, and if you look at what EKS control and kube control do for you, that you'd have to wrap up in a series of API calls, it's a ton, right? So it just made sense for us to rather than to try to peek under the hood at what a particular kube control command was doing, just to call the command. And so that's what code pipeline allows us to do via this build spec.
And I'm curious, like for me, I remember when you first showed me this code, I was like a little bit nervous about it because it felt like I was writing a big old script to essentially be my onboarding. Of course, all this stuff, I guess, is technically scripts if you think about it. But I felt like I was just running a bunch of command line tools. But that's kind of the model, right, for EKS.
At least for EKS, that was It feels like that at least from a DevOps perspective in Kubernetes land. There are things more what they're calling GitOps now, where you got Flux and Argo, these baked in operators that try to reconcile a repo with the state of a cluster. We looked at that. Complexity wise goes way up. We wanted this to be a fairly simple experience. So there is a potential that you could change this more to a GitOps type scenario. That's not what's happening here.
Okay.
And to be fair, there's all kinds of stuff that happens in, user data scripts, which are the scripts that run on EC2 instances when they are provisioned by AWS, that are also scripts, right? They're
They're just, it's a good call out, Michael.
That allow you to set stuff up. And if you go into SaaS Boost, especially to support Windows workloads, there's all kinds of stuff you've got to do to get a Windows operating system ready to participate sort of in a cloud native kind of a way with our container services. There's a huge user data script that's written in PowerShell to pull off. And it looks in a lot of ways pretty similar to what's going on here.
Yeah. And that's really it. I mean, those are the high points. I kind of blew through that. I don't know if there's much more. There's a question in there asking about async, and I think we addressed that in the comments. But the async, it's async in quotes, right? From a JavaScript perspective, it just gives you the appearance that it's running async on that store method.
Toby, I did throw this slide in just because, and I know we're getting close to the end here. So
yeah,
but I do like, you're using these sort of manifests and these other mechanisms also to describe these environments that are sort of classic sort of EKS mechanisms. Do you want to talk a little bit about like how those work? And this may be blurring the line between the workshop and the reference architecture a little bit, but
sure. There's just I'll show you real quick. We've got these template files, right? Like a Kubernetes for a product and order service.
You back over there.
Yeah, let's go back to so for our product service, let's say we've got these placeholders that are in here, right? Like we don't know when we're deploying these things. And when we first deploy them, it's all deployed in a pooled environment. Everybody's hitting these same services, but we need to use these same manifest files for a new deployment, new silo deployment. So if we were gonna bring in, a premium customer and they had their own, Cognito user pool and Cognito client, all that would have to be plugged into these guys at runtime. And that's what was happening inside that build spec file. So this is the actual Kubernetes artifact that gets deployed. And then these capital values here are the ones that get kind of stream edited out before deployment to poke in tenant specific values.
Okay. Yeah. And my takeaway there was only that I think it gets kind of like any tool chain. Once you get into that tool chain, right, you're trying to stay close to the EKS or the Kubernetes tool chain here to use its deployment and its configuration mechanisms. So you aren't leaving all those on the sideline, that you're bringing in the manifest, you're bringing in all the natural constructs. So if you're already familiar with Kubernetes, like these won't be foreign concepts to you. We're mostly just orchestrating those Kubernetes constructs.
Now that was the hard part, right? It's like, if you were to go and read about how do you do multi-tenancy in Kubernetes or EKS, there's lots of information on there in the wild, but how do you automate it? And this was kind of I don't know if it's secret sauce, but it's the way we settled on doing it.
Awesome. Well, I know we're getting close to time here. I don't know if there's a question or two we can sneak in here, but I definitely think, hopefully, I know we kind of rushed through code. I wish we had a little more time. I think we hopped around in the screens and the code kind of quick. So hopefully if you go back and watch the video afterwards, you might get a little more detail, or go look at these actual code that you can go download and dig into these a little bit more. But to me, this was hopefully give you a sort of a higher level view of sort of the bigger role of onboarding in your system, but also give you a sense for just how different it can be depending on the stack and the deployment model and the tiering model and all these other factors that are part of your system. So I don't know, Michael or Toby, if you had any parting thoughts around that.
No, I guess I would just say that a lot of these tool choices, they've got their pros and their cons, right? Like, why didn't we use step functions, for example? Why didn't we just invoke APIs on the API gateway? Why didn't we just invoke Lambdas, right? Well, like, it's all in the same account. We set them all up. Why not just invoke one Lambda to another Lambda? So there's a lot of choices. Why did we choose to use the Kubernetes command line tooling? Right? Toby talked about the decisions behind some of that. So there is no right answer. There's pros and cons to each of those choices. And don't be afraid to iterate. I know in SaaS Boost, I think we're on our third idea of how to wire all this together to be, more flexible, more performant, more fault tolerant, especially because we're trying to build a set of tools for anybody to use. It's got to be generic. So that's what I would say.
Well, I know we're at time, so we're going to have to kind of jump off here, but really appreciate your time, Michael and Toby, and hope you enjoyed the episode. Come back for episode 4. Hopefully we'll keep the ball rolling here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.